the situation of Afghanistan is extremely complex. It requires ongoing attention, and I think it's important for the international community, including the UK, to reflect on their own policies, not only the chaotic evacuation a year ago, but also longer-term UK policy and action that could continue to support Afghanistan, including the efforts and investment that the UK and others have made in Afghanistan for decades, especially since 2001, and perhaps to also reflect on mistakes that have been made by the UK, not excluding the UK forces.
It's been a year since the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban. It's a big question to ask, but what's your assessment of the human rights situation there 12 months on?
Well, I think that 12 months ago, many people, including in the UK, felt a sense of trepidation about the Taliban because of their experience or knowledge of them, some of them in the 1980s and up to 2001. But they were given a little bit of leeway because they had provided some assurances that were not the same, that they had reformed, that they would treat women better, that they would respect human rights, and so on. And I think a year later, we are disappointed because the situation, rather than improving, has turned the clock back more than 20 years in Afghanistan. And while there are some relatively small differences between the policies then and now, in general, women's rights are seriously repressed, and human rights as a whole the same.
It's desperately sad to hear that that's your assessment 12 months on. There will be people, though, who will say it's no surprise because they didn't expect anything better of the Taliban, given the history of how they'd operated in the country. I did see this weekend there was a small group of women protesters who took to the streets of Kabul, and they were very quickly shut down by the Taliban, who opened fire, moving them along. I mean, how dangerous is the situation for women?
Well, yesterday's protest by women was the first for several months, because when they had protested in the months following the Taliban takeover, the response by the Taliban had been quite brutal. They had been arrested, detained. We've received reports of ill treatment in detention. Some of them made to do video confessions. Some made to sign documents that they would not repeat the protests or say anything in public. So it was very brave of them to protest once again, because it's the 1-year anniversary. And as we saw, there was excessive use of force yesterday in shutting it down. Fortunately, I haven't heard of any of the women being hurt, though I did get a report that a couple of journalists were hurt.
Just to touch on that situation in terms of the media, I mean, Afghanistan a year ago had a media. It might not have been as liberal and free a media as we expect in other Western countries, but nevertheless, you did see women on TV, reporters going out and about. How has that changed in terms of the openness of the media and human rights?
I visited Afghanistan in May, and I met members of the media in Kabul and also in 2 other cities, one in the north, Mazar-e-Sharif, and one in the south, Kandahar. And certainly, when they spoke to me, their their access to information and room to report had been restricted a great deal. There is censorship, there is a clampdown on the media. They were more particularly talking about any kind of investigative reporting. Reporting the news seems still to be possible. For example, reporting yesterday's protests. But to go behind the news and to investigate in any way what is going on is not possible. To look into areas where there are fighting is completely restricted, and to criticize or to even question the actions or policies of the Taliban is also censored, and it is worse for women. A lot of media outlets have shut down. There were several hundred in Afghanistan. Many have shut down. Around 80, I'm told 85% of women media workers have lost their jobs. A lot of men have lost their jobs too, but far more women by proportion. And this is a kind of combination of the Taliban restrictions and finance, because the money has dried up for advertising and also support from the international community. So this combination, the restrictions, the clampdown, and the financial struggle have really narrowed the scope of the media in Afghanistan.
In the past 12 months, when you have been to Afghanistan and you visited these cities, have you had interaction with the Taliban? How have they treated you?
Yes, I have. When I visited, I've only made one visit in my official capacity, and I was received by the Taliban, who recognized my mandate, who informed me they wanted to cooperate with the United Nations. They considered themselves as part of the United Nations, or at least the state as part of the United Nations, and they're clearly looking for recognition. So they did meet me, and they did assure me that I could go to different places in the country if I wished. So I haven't experienced barriers from the Taliban. However, what I have experienced is a massive gap between what they say and what they do, and this gap really needs closed. There is a situation, or almost a culture of denial of human rights violations, including violations against women. And no country is perfect when it comes to human rights, least of all Afghanistan. And a good starting point would be an acknowledgement of the problems that exist, and which are, to quite a large degree, being created and exacerbated by the Taliban. You also said that the situation was not perfect before the Taliban took over, and I agree with that. We should not forget. We should not blame the Taliban for the entire situation. Previous administrations have also violated human rights, but they do bear responsibility now for what is happening over the past 12 months.
There are reports of some areas of Afghanistan falling into famine-like situations, or indeed already being in a famine. How desperate is the outlook there? Well, there was a humanitarian crisis, or a humanitarian a dire situation in Afghanistan even before the Taliban takeover. The country had been rocked by decades of conflict and droughts and other natural disasters, and it has just gotten worse. And fortunately, they managed to get through last winter without the outcomes being as awful as predicted.
but the resilience is running low. And this winter will present enormous challenges for the people of Afghanistan. There are extremely high levels of poverty. It's estimated by UNDP that around 97% are living in poverty, and increasing levels of malnutrition, including child malnutrition. So, I've talked about a human rights crisis, but that's closely linked to what is also a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, and likely to get worse.
You are one of the signatories of this letter, UN human rights experts warning of a bleak future without a massive turnaround for Afghanistan. What do governments around the world need to do? What do you want them to do?
Well, I think it's important to keep Afghans at the forefront and to provide even more support, much more support than they have received so far. It's my role to advocate for the situation in Afghanistan. And the people of Afghanistan need just as much support, for example, as the people in Ukraine and in other situations of great need. And that support can be protection for Afghans who are still in Afghanistan and who may need to travel countries, including the UK. Support for Afghan civil society organizations, especially human rights defenders, and among them, especially women, continuing to work in Afghanistan and some outside as well. And the UK, for example, has, I think, offered around $264 million in humanitarian aid this year, half of it to women, and must ensure that those funds reach, or those resources reach those most in need, the most vulnerable, without aiding the Taliban. And then I think it's also very important to keep the pressure up on the Taliban to open girls' schools, to ensure that women's rights as a whole are respected, to start being more inclusive in their government, in their governance, and also to stop discriminating and persecuting religious and ethnic minorities. This is just the start. The situation in Afghanistan is extremely complex. It requires ongoing attention, and I think it's important for the international community, including the UK, to reflect on their own policies, not only the chaotic evacuation a year ago, but also longer-term UK policy and action that could continue to support Afghanistan, including the efforts and investment that the UK and others have made in Afghanistan for decades, especially since 2001, and perhaps to also reflect on mistakes that have been made by the UK, not excluding the UK forces.
We are about to get a new Prime Minister in a few weeks' time. It will either be Liz Truss, who is the Foreign Secretary currently, or it will be Rishi Sunak. Whoever becomes the next British Prime Minister, what do you ask of them?
Well, I think hopefully I've covered that largely already, but to put it in a nutshell, it would be keep paying attention to Afghanistan. Give Afghans, think from the perspective of ordinary Afghans who feel that they were abandoned by the international community. What is your responsibility to such people who were supported after 9/11, who had nothing to do with 9/11, but nevertheless came under tremendous pressure and have had decades of conflict, and now find themselves back in almost exactly the same situation they were 25 years ago with the Taliban regime. There are, of course, some that are less uncomfortable, but there are many who are extremely uncomfortable. And to go back to the chaotic scenes that we saw at Kabul airport a year ago, and to one of your first questions, which is why are we surprised? And I guess when we saw Afghans so desperate to escape the country, even before the Taliban, or just on the cusp of the Taliban taking over, they must have known something. And therefore, perhaps we should not be surprised. And my message to whoever becomes prime minister is to put Afghans first, to think about the terror that they have displayed and that they continue to experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Richard, just before I let you go, I was thinking that when I was on assignment in Afghanistan in 2002, albeit briefly, I remember it was about 9 months after the Taliban had fallen then. It was coming up to the first anniversary of September the 11th. And I remember going around the city, and the driver that I was with pulled up outside the football stadium and said, "Do you want to go and have a look around?" And in my mind, I had a video image that I had seen, knowing what happened in that stadium, which was public executions. And when you think of the Taliban, you think of the awful atrocities that were committed when they previously had power. Have we gone that far back? Are things getting that bad that we will see a return to that type of situation with public executions?
I certainly hope not. And I don't think it's gone that far yet. I think that there is still an open window. And to return to the football stadium, in those 20 years, Afghans have taken to cricket. They've done very well at cricket.
Yeah.
And what we've seen is the Taliban supporting their cricketers. And in that same stadium, I believe, I've seen pictures of large crowds of people, including Taliban leadership, watching cricket matches. Actually, most of them men, not too many women, but nevertheless, I think it is perhaps a small beacon of hope that something like this, like a stadium, there are not yet any signs that I've seen of that stadium being used for public executions, although executions in public have taken place elsewhere. And it is still being used for football and cricket, and those sports are being supported by the Taliban. It would just be nice to see them support women cricketers as well as men.
Absolutely. So there are, in some respects, you try to hold out some positivity that there can be an engagement with the Taliban that is positive for all.
I think we have to. And I think the situation is pretty bleak, as I have said, and when I joined up with that statement. But I think at the same time, we should look to see where there are opportunities, where there are some openings to find common ground. I mean, any kind of sustainable peace needs some agreement about common ground. And in this case, it is an ideological movement. But they are human beings like anyone else. And I think we should continue to try and do that. And if it means playing cricket, well, that's a starting point. If it means agreeing to stop torturing people, that would be even better. So, and if it then could move on to agreeing on greater inclusion and participation and respect for women, that would be better still. I hope that the resort to the use of force, which often seems to be not the last, but the first resort, is abandoned. That is something I think that the UK government could continue to stress with the Taliban leadership.